Hey everyone, I am your host Peter Zablocki and you're listening to History Shorts. I hope everyone's having a great day so far and thank you for making this show a small part of that. If you'd like to help me out with a small gesture, please leave History Shorts a rating or a review and click that subscribe button if you haven't already done so. For sources and books used as the basis for these episodes, how to advertise on the show, and other information such as a list of our upcoming guests on the Conversation series, or a link to our Patreon account where you can listen to exclusive episodes not heard here, please visit www.historyshortspodcast.com. Today's episode is brought to you by the Podcast Republic, your ultimate podcast listening app. Discover and subscribe to thousands of podcasts from around the globe, all in one place. Download Podcast Republic now and take your podcast experience to the next level. Having said all of that, the epic journey of Meriwether Lewis and William Clark across the uncharted American West has been long celebrated as one of the most remarkable feats of exploration in U.S. history. From 1804 to 1806, the Corps of Discovery navigated nearly 8,000 miles of river, plain, mountain, and wilderness in search of a transcontinental route to the Pacific. They encountered dozens of native nations, mapped vast territories, documented new species, and ultimately returned as national heroes. But beneath the heroic narrative and adventure and scientific discovery lies a more uncomfortable, yet historically vital reality: venereal disease, particularly syphilis, which was a constant and deeply disruptive problem for the men of the expedition. It was a hidden affliction that not only shaped individual fates, but also reflected the broader medical, social, and sexual dynamics of early 19th century America. And yet, we somehow don't talk about any of this. Anyway, here is the rest of that story.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
At the time the expedition set out from St. Louis in May 1804, syphilis and gonorrhea were widespread among populations both in Europe and the young United States. Neither disease was well understood. Theories about their origin and transmission were wildly speculative. Some believe they came from bad air, and others from curses or poor moral conduct. Treatment was primitive, painful, and often dangerous. Chief among the so-called cures was mercury, administered in pill form, ointments, and vapor fumigations. While mercury could reduce the visible symptoms of syphilis, such as skin lesions, it often caused debilitating side effects, such as tooth loss, tremors, and in high enough doses, death. The men of the Corps of Discovery were not immune. In fact, given the backgrounds of many of the enlisted men, drawn from military ranks and frontier outposts, venereal disease was practically a given from the expedition's start. These were young, unmarried, sexually active men who had frequented brothels and bars across the Mississippi frontier. The very first months of the expedition, spent in the vicinity of Camp Du Bois near St. Louis, included access to taverns and prostitutes. In his journals, Meriwether Lewis would record multiple instances of illness among the men, sometimes cryptically described as obstructions, or affections of the loins, or painful swellings. Historians and medical scholars have since identified these as venereal in origin. One of the most telling early references came in July of 1804, when Sergeant Charles Floyd, one of the expedition's most trusted non-commissioned officers, fell seriously ill. While he would ultimately die of what is now believed to be a burst appendix, there is evidence that other men around the time were suffering from sexually transmitted diseases. Meriwether Lewis began administering mercury pills to several of them, documenting symptoms that included burning urination, genital ulcers, and muscular pain. William Clark, less prone to euphemism in his writing, once noted that a man was, and I quote, put on the use of mercury pills for the pox, end quote. The pox, of course, was the colloquial term for syphilis. And while the term might conjure images of late-stage facial disfigurement or mental decline, most of the expedition's sufferers likely experienced the primary and secondary stages, painful enough in themselves. The afflicted could find themselves debilitated by weeping sores, fevers, skin rashes, and arthritis-like joint pain that made marching, paddling, or hunting difficult. In such a tightly knit and physically demanding expedition, the incapacitation of even a few men had a serious impact. It is worth pausing to consider the medical treatment itself. Mercury was known even then to be toxic in high doses, but it remained the only remedy available. Lewis carried with him a med kit that included a mercury chloride compound, blue mass or mercury-laced pills, and various botanical concoctions. Some of these were administered orally, others as ointments applied directly to the groin. In extreme cases, doctors of the time would apply mercury vapors in enclosed boxes, causing the patient to swell out both symptoms but also sanity. The Lewis and Clark journals mention several such treatments over the course of the expedition. One man's condition improved under mercury, but another, Private John Shields, experienced such painful mouth sores that he could barely eat for days, a clear sign of mercury toxicity. Mercury wasn't only used for venereal disease. It was something of a cure-all for constipation, fevers, and even melancholy. But the sheer frequency of its use at the time for what were clearly venereal symptoms tells us that syphilis or gonorrhea were present far beyond isolated cases. In one particularly telling episode, in late 1804, Clark described how a man named Hugh Hall was punished for trading whiskey to Native Americans for, and I quote, the purpose of their women. While official policy discouraged such interactions, sexual relations between expedition members and indigenous women occurred throughout the journey. Some were consensual, others likely coercive. In either case, they further complicated the spread of the disease. One of the most controversial aspects of this topic involves Sacagawea, the Shoshone woman who joined the expedition as a translator and guide. Though often romanticized in popular memory, Sacagawea's actual role and status were far from complex. She was a teenage girl, likely about 16 or 17, and the wife, or rather property, of Toussaint Charbonneau, a French-Canadian fur trader much older than she. Charbonneau himself had a questionable reputation and was described by Clark, and I quote, as a man of no particular merit. That Sacagawea may have contracted venereal disease either from her husband or the men she traveled among is a possibility, but one not clearly documented. Still, her proximity to afflicted men and the exploitative sexual norms of frontier life raise uncomfortable but necessary questions. The journals also contain instances of recorded interactions with Native women in ways that suggest a commodification of sex. When the expedition stayed with the Nez Perce and later the Chinook along the Columbia River, Clark wrote with fascination about the local customs of temporary wife lending, wherein women would be offered to visitors for trade or hospitality. The cultural context was far more complex than the explorers understood. It could be a form of diplomacy or spiritual exchange, but to the core of discovery, it often translated to sexual availability. Given the known prevalence of syphilis in indigenous communities, often introduced by European fur traders, it is likely that both the Americans and the natives suffered renewed waves of infection from these interactions. The return journey in 1806 saw renewed health struggles. Several men suffered relapses marked by physical weakness, genital pain, and skin problems. Clark noted a man with ulcers of the thighs and another with pains in the loins once again. Symptoms, as we mentioned, consistent with venereal disease. While the Corps returned to St. Louis to great fanfare, many of its members bore the long-term consequences of disease, including chronic pain and possibly neurological decline in later years. One theory even suggests that Meriwether Lewis himself, who committed suicide in 1809, may have suffered from neurosyphilis, a late-stage form of the disease that affects the brain and causes depression, paranoia, and memory loss. While no conclusive evidence exists, his erratic behavior in the final years of his life has prompted considerable speculation. The story of venereal disease on the Lewis and Clark expedition also intersects with broader themes of American expansionism, race, and morality. The Corps of Discovery was in many ways a microcosm of the early American Republic, predominantly male, ethnically diverse, and full of contradictions. They were missionaries of science, you might say, and empire, tasked with observing, recording, and claiming. Yet they carried with them not just books, weapons, and surveying tools, but also diseases, biological symbols of both conquest and vulnerability. Today, venereal disease may not feature prominently in the textbook versions of the Lewis and Clark saga, but it was undeniably part of the journey, one more shadow cast on the long trail west. Thanks for listening.